Shall we start? So I'm really delighted to welcome Professor Maria Abreu from the Department of Land Economy in Cambridge, a fellow of Pembroke, professor of economic geography. She has been working on on a wide range of topics related to human development, economic development, and geography, bringing together an amazing set of issues, very practical in her work. Although I have the privilege of knowing Maria for how many years? We have not counted.
10, 15.
Well, we have written papers together, we have taught together. But she has done so many things that I need a piece of paper just to be able to be precise, to share with you, for instance, that before she started lecturing in Cambridge, she worked for the poverty team at the World Bank office in Jakarta, Indonesia, on policy initiatives to promote child nutrition and educational transitions. Now, her PhD thesis was related to human capital. She has done a lot on migration, on productivity, markets, and political geography, which is something we are going to discuss today. But she was also a policy research fellow at the Cambridge MIT Institute, working on several projects related to diffusion and innovation. So you might get in that sense of interdisciplinarity that was mentioning to you at the beginning. She has worked as a consultant for the European Commission, the World Bank, the UK's Department of Business Innovation and Skills, the National Endowment for Science, Technology and Arts, and the Department for Enterprise, Trade and Investment of Northern Ireland. So it was amazing. Sometimes we are writing some papers together and say, oh, I'm going to talk to this kind of Downing Street people and discuss high-level policy. What? Yeah. So it's amazing interest of what we normally call social impact, that she's very committed, that her work is not simply within academia, but it's involved in issues that matter to people. Now, she has been a chair of this very prestigious Regional Science Association International British and Irish session since 2018, and she also a co-editor of journals such as Spatial Economic Analysis and Regional Science Policy and Practice, as well as advisory editor of the Journal of Research Policy. Now, Maria, thank you so much. You're extremely kind and generous. Yesterday, we made Maria have so many meetings here with so many of you here discussing possibilities of collaboration. So thank you so much. Very generous with your time and being with us here. It's really an honor and a privilege to have you here. So thank you so much.
Many thanks, Flavio, for that very kind introduction. I think we've known each other for 15 years, probably. That's when we started teaching the same course. Okay, so so this presentation, as Flavio said, my work is very interdisciplinary. I'm an economist by training, but I'm now more of a geographer. But I'm also interested in philosophy and history and sociology. So I'm in between a lot of disciplines. And this work I'm going to talk about also touches on political science. So hopefully something for everyone. I've called it the geography of discontent and addressing the challenge of left behind places. So I thought I'd start with some context. Why should we care about this? It's a little bit tricky, so towards the end I'll come back to the ethics. So do we need to do something sort of in policy terms if people vote for parties that are populist? Is this something that we should ethically address or not? It's quite a tricky issue. But anyway, I'll come back to that. So I think we've all observed in many countries, in the UK where I live, but many countries around the world, an increase in support for populism, mainly on the right, but also on the left. And what's interesting as a geographer or an economic geographer is the fact that this vote is highly clustered in space. So it's not random across the entire geography, but there are pockets of populist vote. And so it's interesting to try to understand why this is happening. And then I guess the second step, I'll try to convince you that there are these pockets or clustered pockets of populist votes. And then the question is this due to economics, or is it cultural or demographic? What's causing it? And then finally, the tricky question from a methodological point of view is this because we have these pockets have a high number of people who tend to vote for these parties anyway, so maybe they have self-selected into these places, or is there something about these regions that is causing everyone to be more likely to vote for populism? So, for example, closing of a big factory that employed local people, or historical issues. So I will come back to this because methodologically this is really tricky. Okay. Because I'm a sort of self-identified geographer, I've got quite a few maps, so just to show you what I mean. So the first map, and I've tried to pick the most recent elections. This is the 2024 presidential election in the US that Trump won. So Donald Trump won by, I've got the national vote margin was only 1.5 points over Kamala Harris. However, if you look at the geography, you can see how clustered it is. So this is at the smaller district level, congressional district level. And you can see very clearly how there's a concentration of Kamala votes on the East Coast and the West Coast, and then pockets around the big cities, particularly the cities that have highly innovative industries. And then most of the other areas have very strong concentrations of Trump vote. Oh, sorry, I should have said blue is the Kamala Harris Democratic vote, and red is the Republican vote. Oh, just one other thing. So I'm showing you districts rather than states, because if you look at states, it's very red. And so the interesting patterns are often at a smaller geographical scale. And of course, this map is slightly deceiving because it looks like Trump won most of the country, but that's because the more densely populated areas are the blue ones. Okay, this is the recent German election, which is really striking as well. So, the black areas are the conservative CDU/CSU vote, and the blue areas are the AfD vote, the populist far-right party. And then the reds are the socialist SPD. And what's so striking is that you can still see the boundaries of the old West and East Germany so clearly on this electoral map, with the exception of Berlin, which is a pocket of, I guess, more left-wing voters. And then finally, this is the most recent election in the UK. This was a local election just 2 weeks ago, and it wasn't in the whole country, so we alternate some districts that have local elections every 2 years. And so this is just showing the councils that changed from one party to another, where the control changed. The light blue areas are the ones that were changed to Reform. Reform is our AfD equivalent, so far-right populist party, anti-immigration and so on. And yellow are the Liberal Democrats. So this is a sort of very old-fashioned, very long, Liberal party with a very long history, which is now, because of the way Labour has moved to the right, much more progressive than the Labour Party on a lot of issues, but they're very strong in the old Tory strongholds in rural England, educated areas and so on. And so what's interesting is that voters moved, because of the unpopularity of the Conservative Party, the opposition, and the Labour Party in government, voters have moved to both the left and the right. So we can see Reform won a lot of areas that are, I'll talk about this, so left behind, declining areas. And the Liberal, so these yellow areas are, this is Cambridgeshire, this is Oxfordshire, and this is Shropshire, which is a sort of very leafy, pleasant, sort of slightly wealthier place. So, so you can see the polarization happening in the local elections as well. Okay. So I hope I've convinced you that there are clusters in this vote, and the interesting question is, why is this happening? And I've been working on regional inequalities for a very long time, since my PhD back in the 2000s. And I think when the 2016 was a really important year for us, who studied these topics, because we had the Brexit vote in June, and the first Trump election in November. And I think most people didn't realize the link between the regional inequalities and the vote. And this was the moment when people became aware of it, because the differences were so stark. So I want to talk about regional inequality. So what's driving those clusters? What's behind them? And so I'm going to start with the economics, and then I'm going to talk about the cultural demographic issues. I have another one. I think this is the last map. So this is a map of Europe, and it's showing regionals using something called, so the EU uses a classification called NUTS. So NUTS 0 are countries, NUTS 1 are large regions like London and so on. So these are NUTS 2 regions, just below the large regions. And it's showing GDP per capita in these regions adjusted for price differences relative to the EU average. So the blue areas are the richer ones, and the pink and the red are the poorer ones relative to the EU average. This map is about 10 years old. The reason I still use it is because it's the last map we have that still has the UK in it, because we have left Eurostat, sadly. And then what you can see is, I think not surprisingly, the Scandinavian countries are fairly wealthy compared to the EU average. They're also very equal internally, so I'll come back to that. A sort of an agglomeration in the center of Europe, which has highly innovative firms, highly skilled workers, and then sort of areas in parts of the south and the east of Europe poorer than the average, but of course all the large cities are richer. So concentrations of skilled workers and high wages in the large cities. And then what I want to draw your attention to is the UK, which is a really good case study, because the UK is the most unequal country in Europe regionally. So if you look at the UK, you can see London is, I'm not sure if it still is, but at least historically has been the richest region in Europe. But most of the rest of the country, or almost the entire rest of the country, is below the EU average, and in some cases equivalent to the poorest regions in Europe. So it's really striking. And an important thing, something important to note is that if you live in London, it's a really nice place to live, everything works, it's very wealthy. It's very hard to imagine that there are regions in your country that are so poor. And if you don't travel, you don't see it. So often politicians and policymakers are just not aware that this is happening. And when I show this map in London, people are just completely shocked, and they don't believe me, and they try to, they're looking for, is this a mistake? Anyway, so I guess these regional inequalities are what we're trying to understand. This is in economic terms, but I'll come back to the cultural issue in a minute. So this is a graph that the Financial Times did a few years ago, just showing the same thing, but in a diagram rather than in a map. So these bars are countries. I've got the country code at the top. This includes more than just Europe. It includes all of the OECD countries. And the height of the bar shows you the extent of the inequality. Each of these small lines are regions. And you can see the UK is the most unequal. So the top region being part of London. These are smaller scales, sorry, NUTS 3, roughly. Part of Camden and the City of London in London, and the poorest one is an area in Northern Ireland. The next two are Germany and France, and Romania and Poland. These are all quite large countries, so large countries tend to have more regional inequalities just because redistribution is harder. At the other end, we have New Zealand, fairly small countries, New Zealand, Malta, Finland, Sweden, and some of the other Nordic countries. Okay, the last point I want to make on regional inequalities is when I was doing my PhD in the early 2000s, we were using 1990s data, and at that point, the big story was convergence. So poorer regions were catching up, and we thought eventually we would get fairly reduction in inequality and convergence. And this is what all the papers were about. And that's what I found in my PhD, because I was using 1990s data. But so unbeknownst to us, things had changed. And globalization had actually started a process of divergence. And what we observe now is that these regional inequalities are actually getting worse. So, so this is for the UK. Again, these are districts, and this is showing education levels relative to the national average. And what we see is places that are highly educated are becoming more educated over time, and places that have low numbers of graduates are becoming even, having fewer over time. And education is a big driver of both economic growth and productivity, but also voting patterns. So the inequalities are getting worse. Okay, so to summarize, there are successful cities and regions, and these are highly productive because they have skilled workers and innovative firms. They are productive because workers and firms can share knowledge, they can share the use of the same inputs, there's better matching of workers to jobs that are specialized. And so for all those reasons, workers in big cities that are innovative are more productive, so they earn higher wages, and that attracts more workers. And this is a process that we call agglomeration economies. But then, of course, that happens in the big successful regions and cities. And then the other places see that process in reverse. So skilled workers go from these regions to the big cities, and they gradually become less productive, older, less educated, less healthy, and so on. And then once this process starts, if you don't do anything, it will just continue, unless you have a big shock that completely redistributes where industry is located. There's some debate in this literature about data and how to measure it and the size of regions, which I'm happy to talk about. But I think many papers have found this in many settings. And so in terms of policy, what do we need to address? If we agree that this is a problem, we need to first address the root causes using economic policies and redistribution and other things, industrial policy. And secondly, I think, this is my theory, and in the paper I wrote with Flavio, our theory, that we also need to address the feeling of discontent. Because what happens is, even if you redistribute, and we saw this with EU cohesion funds and so on, you redistribute, you get a lot of funding. That doesn't necessarily solve the grievances that people have, which are historical. So, so in my talk, I'm going to focus on the second, but I will touch, I'm happy to come back to the actual policies as well, the economic policies. Okay, yes?
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Are you including in this inequality or these fresh policies both industrial policy and income redistribution, which may not be the same?
They're different policies. Do you mean the ones that lead to discontent?
To try to relocate industries,
yeah.
and that would be industrial policy and things, to try to subsidize with unemployment benefits, social benefits, those left behind.
Yeah. Of course, I agree that they're different things. They're different things. And in terms of what addresses the discontent, I'm not sure if this is your point, but I agree with you that providing jobs is more impactful than just redistributing. Yeah, yeah, I fully agree, it's different, yeah. Okay, so maybe very briefly on the economic causes, just to summarize. So I mentioned that until the 1990s, we saw a process of convergence. This is when we were all writing about wonderful convergence. But then we had globalization, and globalization led to an offshoring of jobs. And the key issue is that these jobs in traditional industries that went mainly to Asia, they were located at different places in the geography, in countries. So if you imagine the US, the job losses were fairly spread across the geography. But the new jobs that were created by globalization are highly concentrated. So these are jobs in research and development, highly skilled jobs, and the other jobs that emerge because they service those jobs. So the job losses happen across a large geography in all towns and cities, but the job gains were highly concentrated, and this is what caused the inequalities, very roughly. And then the effect is magnified by all the indirect jobs. So when you create a high-tech job in San Francisco, we know from a lot of research that this generates several other jobs, say in cafes, in restaurants, in housing, in cleaning and so on, transport. And the estimate is for high-tech jobs, this multiplier effect is between 3 and 5. So for one high-tech job in, say, Apple, there are another 3 to 5 jobs created in the local area as a result. And the multiplier is slightly smaller for lower skilled jobs, but it's still there. And then, of course, you have migration. So these successful places like San Francisco, Seattle, and so on, attracted more young workers. And again, the migration exacerbates the inequalities. And then finally, state spending, which is traditionally a way of evening out these inequalities. This was a period during which there was some cuts in funding. We had the financial crisis. And again, politicians like to invest in successful places. And this is what happened. So again, this exacerbates the inequalities. Okay. Just briefly want to mention, because it's not just about income and productivity, there are other effects that come with these inequalities. So we see, if you look at those maps, if you draw a map for other variables like healthy life expectancy, maternal and infant health, obesity, smoking, drug addiction, teenage pregnancies, all of these variables associated with poverty and areas of decline are also, the map is almost identical. So these income inequalities translate into social inequalities as well. And then economic decline tends to worsen public health problems because areas lose their tax base. They have less money, but more problems because the healthy and young outmigrate. So in the US, these regions in decline also have very big opioid problems. And these are actually Trump's kind of strongholds as well, even though he has some strange policies on opioids. And then if you have poor health, of course, that worsens productivity problems because workers who are in poor health are less productive. And so again, there are these feedback mechanisms. Oh yes, I wanted to show you the opioid map because it's really striking. So this is the deaths that are linked to opioid addiction. And you can see how the map is sort of strongly correlated with the election map and also with the income map, which I haven't shown you for the US, but it's basically the same pattern. Okay, so that's the sort of economic inequality story. And now I want to talk about the politics. Okay, what do we observe in these areas? We observe voter disengagement, so people just don't care about politics, or they think politics is not for them. They don't read the news. They have low political efficacy, which means they think that it doesn't matter how they vote, it will have no effect. So the feeling that their vote makes no difference. And we see then low turnout in elections. In some of the literature, these places are called left behind areas. I'm not sure if I like the term, so I've put it in inverted commas, but this is something people use. And so this is linked to a perception that not just in these places, but outside as well, these places have no future. And often you hear, there's a strong line of argument that some people use that we should just let them decline. Invest in the successful places, let people move around, let the market work. So if people should find a job in the successful places and we just leave these places to decline. And this is a perception that is really strong in these places. So when you ask them, they say, people have forgotten about us, politicians don't care, they only come during election time. And in these places that are successful, this is where politicians love success. They love to open new projects in places that are successful. And then this leads to a huge amount of resentment and grievances. There's a paper by Andrés Rodriguez Pose that was written in 2018. And I guess he just consolidated what a lot of people were thinking at the time. So this really touched a nerve. It's called The Revenge of the Places That Don't Matter and What to Do About Them. It's a discursive paper, but it's really interesting because it captured that feeling at the time, 2018, 2 years after 2016 when we had all those shock elections. Okay, so I'll start with the economic grievances and then I'll talk about the cultural side. So there are really two schools of thought. There's one school of thought that says this is all about the economics. So people have no hope, they have no jobs, high unemployment, and if we were just to fix that, then that will address the grievances. And then this is linked, of course, to globalization, which is what we know caused the inequalities to worsen in the first place. And so there's a lot of research showing that places that were more impacted by globalization, because they had the kinds of industries that were offshored to China, were more likely to vote for Trump. And then there's similar studies in the UK for the Brexit referendum. And then I mentioned that there were cuts in government spending in a lot of countries after the 2008-9 crisis. And again, this is quite strongly linked. Or at least the places that had the cuts were the places that had these increase in the populist vote. Okay, that's one school of thought. The other one is cultural. So in political science, in sociology, in other disciplines, people have tried to understand whether there was a cultural shift. And there's a really interesting book by Norris and Engelhardt, which captures a lot of their previous research. I highly recommend it. It's called Cultural Backlash, a brilliant book. And so what they argue is that we're seeing a long-term shift in values towards a more right-wing populist, authoritarian set of values. In their book, it's all about, it's generational. So they argue that the baby boomers in particular have had a fairly good, stable life in terms of the economics, so they're financially very stable. And so they are more susceptible to cultural shifts because this is what they are not so stable on or not so secure in. So they argue that younger generations are now better educated, more liberal, more open-minded, they more likely to go to university, and this causes the older generations to feel that things are moving too fast and they want to stop it. Okay, this is the argument. So older generations feel alienated, and so they vote for parties that promise to stop the change. And then in this theory, the process is exacerbated by young people going to cities, particularly to go to university, and then when they come back, or the older generations see them again, they are changed, they are very liberal, and this is alienating. And in fact, in a lot of surveys, a thing that comes up very clearly is that these people living in these areas and who vote for populist parties, the number one thing they resent after immigration is universities. That they really hate universities. They feel that this is a place that is indoctrinating the young. It's quite striking, which is why you get a lot of these parties promising to be tough on universities. Now, this was really convincing at the time the book came out, 2019. But since then, we've seen several votes, particularly in France and Germany, where there's been an increase in the populist vote among the young. So this doesn't quite fit. And we don't know exactly why. So why are the young becoming, particularly the youngest generation, so the ones in the middle, my generation, are still sort of fairly stable, not changing how they vote, but it's the youngest generation that is turning towards the populist right. And there are many arguments. We can talk about it later, maybe. So this is the cultural shift. I think it needs an update, and I think people are still discussing what is happening. So to put it together, this is comes from a paper by Danny Roderick, who's a trade economist, but he also has done a lot of work on the impact of trade on the rise of populism. And this is from a paper where he sort of summarized the growing literature on this. And this is a really nice diagram, which I've changed slightly. So it starts from, in his original version, it has trade shocks at the top. So this would be the globalization, offshoring shock. I've changed it to economic shocks because I think the financial crisis and similar crisis, COVID maybe, had a similar effect. So the economic shocks cause some inequalities and therefore some economic grievances. And these lead to, on the demand side, so this is the demand side and the supply side of the populist vote. On the demand side, the economic grievances lead to preferences for populism. So this is the geography of discontent story. And then he argues the economic grievances lead to cultural grievances. So they become an identity. So people have lost their jobs, and now they're part of an identity of people who've lost their jobs because of globalization or immigration. Not that they lose their jobs because of that, but it becomes a sort of cultural identity. And then that also affects policy preferences for populism. Now, the important bit, I think, is that these economic grievances also lead to political parties changing their program, right? So they sense an opportunity in the market, they change what they're offering, and therefore that also increases the populist vote. And we've seen lots of the Republican Party in the US, the Conservative Party in the UK, moving very far to the right, offering something different. Also, the parties can change the culture because they can advertise, they can promote certain views, which then change social attitudes and lead to higher populist vote. So it's coming from different directions, and it's quite complex. I also, this is an alternative version, so I think this is a bit narrow because it all starts from the economic shocks. But there are other shocks like COVID or demographic change or institutional change. For example, Donald Trump changing a lot of institutions that can cause changing cultural views. So I think it doesn't just have to be economic in its root. I'm not sure about, so there's some debate about the link between the economic grievances and the cultural ones. And we think in some papers we've written that this is more historical. So if you have an economic grievance, in the UK, the classic example is closing of the coal mines by Margaret Thatcher. This caused, it was a big shock, everyone lost their jobs in a small area. Very strong cultural identity linked to that. But the cultural identity survives regardless of the economic context in the present day. Okay, so that's roughly the model. Okay, I thought I'd talk about Brexit briefly just because it's quite interesting. So when Brexit happened, of course, it was a shock, bad in many ways for the country, but for us working on this topic, a great case study. So I'm just briefly going to show you what I think are some of the lessons. Okay, so the Brexit vote was normally in the UK, all the votes are done because we use a first past the post system. So whoever wins each area gets elected to that area. So whether it's a small district or a constituency for the parliament. But the Brexit vote was a national vote, and every vote counted. So in a normal election, if you live in a safe seat and you want to vote for a different party, your vote has very little value. But in a national referendum, every vote matters. So the turnout was actually quite high. And the referendum had huge regional inequalities, much bigger than what we see in a national general election. So it ranged from, this is the pro-Brexit vote, from 8% in Hackney, a very diverse area of London, to 88% in Staffordshire moorlands, sort of a very deprived area in the Midlands. The Cambridge, so as you'd expect, the big university towns, most of the cities also had very small Brexit votes. And so the places that voted for Brexit were older, had fewer graduates, and had more job insecurity of different forms. But the interesting thing is that doesn't mean that the poorest people in these places and those who are unemployed were the ones who voted for Brexit. So within these places, what we found is it tended to be those who were slightly wealthier than the average and more educated who voted for Brexit. So it's not a clear cut. We can't assume from the regional inequality, so the regional pattern, that this is the same for individuals. And I'll come back to this. It's the individuals within context issue. And then in younger, more dynamic places, the ones that voted against Brexit, even people who were older and less educated were more likely to vote against Brexit. So the context really affected how people voted. Okay, this is the map of the Brexit votes. So a few striking things. You can see all of Scotland voted against. So blue is the against Brexit and red is for. Northern Ireland divided pretty much on sort of the old lines, sectorial lines, but again, most of Northern Ireland voted against. All the big cities, so Cambridge is here, Oxford, most of London, apart from the outer suburbs that are older, and so on. Most of the big cities, apart from Birmingham and Sheffield, I think, people were quite upset in those places about it was very small margin, but most of the cities voted against Brexit. And then the poorest areas in Wales, I'll come back to Wales, this bit around the south of Wales, they're called the valleys. These are the areas that have a very big coal mining industry. The mines were closed and there are historical grievances, and most of the coastal areas as well, which in the UK are some of the most deprived because of complex reasons, which I can talk about later if there's interest. Okay, I thought I'd show you, this is just for fun, but also it's quite interesting in terms of the issues we are considering. These are some of the adverts used by the Pro-Brexit Leave campaign. These were shown on Facebook and targeted at people based on their demographics or the data that Facebook has. And initially, Facebook refused to release them, and a parliamentary committee had to force them. And so this is the result of what they released to the parliamentary committee. You can have a look at them here. It's really interesting how they changed the font to target different people, for example. Anyway, I want to show them to you because you can see what the messaging is. So the first thing is the slogan of the campaign was "Vote Leave, take control." This is really interesting because this feeling of not having control is part of what's driving a lot of this discontent. These first ones are about trade, so sort of what Brexit was actually about. So let's take back control over an economy and trade. And then this red thing says, "Stop the EU now!" exclamation mark. And so if you click on it, then you are sent more material. And then this one, let's give the NHS the 350 million pounds we hand over to the EU every week. Now, this was a famous lie, so this figure was actually a lie. But they said it so many times that people believed it. So you see this figure in a lot of the adverts. So this one is about the National Health Service, which was struggling at the time and is struggling even more now. And so the idea was they're going to get all the money we send to the EU. These two are about immigration, another big part of the campaign, although not really about Brexit, but linked to it by the campaign. The first one is, this is our only chance. We need a points-based immigration system, and then you click on I agree. And of course, visually, really striking, all these people falling off the island. We did get a points-based system after Brexit, which increased immigration by 1 million a year. So anyway, just as an aside. The second one is scaremongering about Turkey joining the EU. So they've got Turkey's 76 million people are joining the EU. Good news, yes, no. And then it's got, this is the relative wages of the UK and Turkey, sort of highlighting what might happen, I guess. Okay. There are some about Eurocrats. So these are Eurocrats taking limousines and private jets with your money. So they spend your money on private jets for short distance travel. This is outrageous and must be stopped. And then here are some more interesting ones. So this was targeted at left-wing voters. So this is maternity units are being closed. Let's spend the money we send to the EU on maternity units instead. And then this one, the EU puts pressure on unions and workers' rights. So quite interesting, targeting the sort of what we call the Lexiter left-wing Brexit voters. And some of my favorites, this one, the EU blocks our ability to speak out and protect polar bears. Click to protect them. So I guess aimed at people who watch animal videos on Facebook. And then this one, now the EU wants to ban tea kettles. Take back control, and then there's a mug being smashed. So you can see some of these grievances and insecurities that they are playing on. Oh, sorry, one final one. These two are targeted at specific geographical areas. So the first one is, do you prefer 350 million pounds a week to the EU or flood defences for Yorkshire? Yorkshire is a region in England that has a really strong regional identity, and they had suffered some flooding in previous years, and there had to be some work on flood defences. So you can see how this is very effective. And then you decide EU or Yorkshire. So my husband's from Yorkshire, And there's only one answer that a Yorkshire person can give to this question, which is Yorkshire. And then, of course, you're sent more material. And then this one is about the steel industry, which is, again, or was at the time, located in 2 places. So, and these are places that have declined because other industries have closed down. So and these are really the big employers in the area. So you can see how targeting this would have been very effective. Okay, so just to summarize the insights from Brexit, it was not necessarily about the EU. As you can see from the advertising, only the first bit was. And many different people voted for it because of different reasons, often contradictory reasons. You see the left-wing vote and the right-wing vote. The higher Brexit vote can reflect local concerns. These areas were targeted, and the advertising would probably have amplified these messages and these concerns. So I think supporting a lot of the things that the literature has found that I said earlier. Okay, just for the final bit, I want to show you some results from some of my work, some of it with Flavio. The first one is what to do about this issue of self-selection versus context. So this is is it the people who live in the town and who they are, or is it something about the area that causes everyone to be more likely to vote for these parties? And so I've just a very simple example here. We have 2 towns, Town A and Town B, and 2 types of people, so the blue ones and the grey ones, when you can assign any attribute. For example, the grey ones might be older and the blue ones might be younger. And then let's assume that Town A voted for Brexit. And what does that mean? What can we infer from that? The problem is that Town A may have voted for Brexit because the grey people are more likely to vote for Brexit anyway, regardless of where they are. And Town A just has more of these grey voters. But it could be that Town A is next to a coal mine that was closed down, and so Town A is really aggrieved about this. So how do we separate the composition effect from the context? So what we have tried to do, among other things, is use a matching approach. So I'm just going to simplify it a lot in this example. So if we match people who are very similar, and we can match on a large number of attributes, the more detailed we make it, the more narrow our sample becomes. So there is a trade-off between choosing more attributes to try to capture everything and choosing fewer but having a bigger sample. But if we match people who are very similar, and then remove everyone we can't match, or everyone who is, there are different ways of doing it, but anyway, very simplistically, if we remove everyone else, we end up with 2 samples living in different places who are very similar. And then we can see if there's a contextual effect. So did this sample in Town A really vote for Brexit? In which case, there must be something else going on, a contextual effect. Okay, so these are some of the results. And then we compared places depending on different characteristics, economic, social, cultural, using individual level data where we know how people voted, and a lot of characteristics about them, including education, age, occupation, salary, where they live, even the newspaper they read, how often they check social media, that kind of thing. So the first category here is places that have a high level of far-right vote. So these are places that are strongholds of the far-right party. So before Reform, the Reform Party in the UK was previously the Brexit Party, and before that they were called UKIP, UK Independence. So these are places where that party was very, very strong versus places where it wasn't. If we just look at the difference in the vote between these places, it's about 12 percentage points for Brexit, higher Brexit votes. If we adjust for composition, this goes down to 7.7. So there's still a strong, as you'd expect, effect in these strongholds, but it's smaller because they tend to have older voters and so on, people who would normally vote for Brexit anyway. Okay, and then we looked at a large number of other variables. So if an area is a low wage growth area, there's a slightly higher Brexit vote, only 2.2 percentage points, very weak. And it doesn't really change much after you adjust. So there is an effect, or not an effect, or an association with low wage growth, but it's quite weak. Skills, so places that are highly skilled had 8 percentage points lower Brexit vote, so educated places tend to vote against Brexit, and it reduces by almost half after the composition effect, because these are places that are young and so on. Places that had high immigration levels tended to, in this case, 4 percentage points lower support for Brexit. That's because high immigration places are the big cities. So, and these places are anti-Brexit anyway. So there's no evidence to say that immigration was associated with the Brexit vote, actual immigration numbers. And in any case, it disappears after controlling for composition. The thing that matters is whether the place had anti-immigration views, so the culture. And these are typically places that have almost no immigration. So it's a slight contradiction there. People watch the national news, they get very upset about immigration, but they don't actually have a lot of immigrants. And this holds even after the composition control. And then finally, we included several measures of cultural values. I picked one, but it holds for almost all of them. So places that were anti-same-sex marriage. Now, this was being discussed at the time. And there are, it's associated with 6.5 higher percentage points vote for Brexit, and this holds after the composition, after we control for composition. And the sort of in summary, I think I have it on the next slide. But anyway, in summary, the economic variables have very little effect on the vote. After controlling for composition, the effect is mostly in the cultural variables. And then it depends on whether you treat high skills education as cultural or economic, because it's both. So, so the only one that matters is education, but that is also a cultural variable. Okay, so we found that the composition effect explains 1/3, and 2/3 are context, but the context is mainly cultural, or almost exclusively cultural. Economic context has very little explanatory power, and we were actually quite upset when we got this result, because as economists or economic geographers, this means, you know, what do we do with this? Normally we'd think, oh, what are the policies we can implement? But if it's all cultural, what do we do? So I'll come back to this in a minute. So if cultural context is all that matters, what do we do with policy? And I think this is the crucial question, and this is where our work with Flavio comes in. Okay, what to do about it? At the time of the Brexit debates, there was an interesting report which was published by a think tank called Demos. They do some work on things related to democracy and community participation, that kind of thing. And they surveyed a lot of I think it was focus groups, but anyway, they interviewed a lot of voters in some of these declining places that had voted for Brexit and asked them, what do you want to see in terms of policy? And the main finding was that voters were willing to have less money in their area if they have more control over how it was spent. So the biggest issue people had was that public funding seemed to be decided somewhere else. And a lot of these places received EU funding, and there are big EU signs everywhere saying this road was built by the EU. But instead of making people feel pro-EU, it just made them angrier because they felt had no say on the money being spent on this stadium or whatever. And they felt there are other problems in the area that are more important, and why couldn't the money be spent on that? Of course, it wasn't the EU's fault. It was the local regions that decided what to apply for, but that was the association they had. Okay, so it seems, I think, what I'm trying to say, coming out of all of this, it's about control and agency, and that's what seems to be driving a lot of the grievances. This was some other work we did looking at the former coal mining towns in the UK and comparing them to other places that were similarly poor, but without the history of decline. And we looked at several variables, so related to politics and voting. The circles just show where voters in these places stand relative to the line, which is the sample of other places that were similar but without the history. And you can see they're less likely to say that democracy works well, that voting is a civic norm, that there are personal benefits from voting, They also say they're more likely to say that they have little say in what the government does, they have low interest in politics, and so on. So just confirming that, well, in this paper we were looking at whether the history can explain it, and it can. Okay, the final bit is, this is the paper I've done with Flavio. So trying to work out how we can, in practical terms, use insights from, in this case, a capability approach to generate agency in public policy. And this is where I've presented it to various government departments in other countries as well, and in the UK. And I think we're still working on how to make this practical, because we need to find a way of doing this in practice. So the most important issue, I think, is the lack of trust. And so we know more or less what good policies look like, economic policies. There's a huge amount of research on what's been tried and what's worked. I think the problem what we don't know how to do is generate trust, or at least what we don't do very well. So people in these places, what they lack is agency, and this generates the lack of trust, or at least that's our argument. And this is why the Take Back Control was such a really clever slogan, because this is what people felt. Yes, I want to take back control. I don't feel I have control. I'd be really interested to know if in other countries the slogans are similar. And so we need not just good outcomes, but we need a process that makes people feel that they're involved. So just giving them the money, as we did with the EU cohesion funds, at least in the UK case, doesn't seem to fix all of the issues that we have. I won't go into this, but if you're interested in the paper, this is Flavio and I spent, and another colleague, Calvin Jones, we spent, I think, 6 months on this diagram, trying to explain where we felt everything fitted in. So the key thing I want to highlight is just the final outcomes of the policy process, and not just the capabilities. So this is the real opportunities that people should have to live a life that they think is valuable, but also agency and freedom. So there should be not just good outcomes, but the agency to decide what happens to you in your life, and a process for achieving that is fair and transparent. And the argument is, if we have that process, then that leads to support for the institutions. And I think this is where we're going wrong. So institutions are breaking down because there's no trust in the system. So we have a feedback loop. Okay, so I'm nearly finished. Our proposal has 3 steps. This is what we've built with the policymakers. How can we do this? So at least in the UK context, what we're always told is there's no money. So we don't have any money. Whatever you propose has to be doable, but also without costing anything. So we have 3 steps. The first step costs no money. And this is where we have a narrative shift. So instead of policymakers saying, what we need is more roads, or we need to increase productivity, or more innovation, we try to say, okay, we're building roads so that you can get to the shops quicker, or so you can access jobs, or so you can visit your friends. So articulate what it is that people care about, and then work out what policies we need to achieve that. So, and at the moment it's back to front, because what we're saying is, at least in the UK, we're frequently told we need to build 1,000 houses in your area because this is going to generate productivity. And people just feel, well, I don't want the houses because we don't have services, we don't have roads, and it's not going to do anything for me. I don't care about productivity. So this is the narrative shift. The second step is how to involve people in designing the policies. And there are different levels of involvement. So this is some form of deliberative democratic participation between elections, because it's not enough just to have elections with low turnout. We need to do something else between elections. And then the final step is more difficult. So this is where we involve communities in co-designing the policies. But it's doable. There are many examples around the world of how to do this. So in the paper we discuss many examples. I'm happy to come back to this. People have questions. These are the different levels of involvement of the community. The ideal, the final level, is where they're actually involved in designing policies, and some examples are participatory budgeting, where people are assigned a proportion of the budget and then they decide how to use it. But there are other examples in between, for example, citizens' assemblies and so on. At the moment in the UK, we are sort of here, where the most that will happen is a focus group, where people are asked, do you think this is a brilliant idea for a development? And people say no, and then it still happens. So this is why we have that democratic deficit. Okay, final thoughts. So I hope I've convinced you that this geography of discontent is linked to lack of trust in government and that it has complex causes. We can address the economic root causes using a combination of national economic policies and place-based policies, which had gone out of fashion but seem to be back in fashion. So I can talk about this if there's interest later on. But the biggest problem, I think, is we need to generate trust and involve residents in co-design of policies. And then finally, I mentioned this earlier, but I think there are big ethical dilemmas. So if we think it's all cultural and identity-based, is it really our job to try to change it, how people vote? And I think, at least I struggle with this. I find it a difficult problem. Okay? Yeah, these are the papers and my email. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Maria. Now, we have some time for questions. Now, she was really on time according to what we said. Very British, yes, on that note. So we have some time for questions. We do have an extra microphone here. So the only thing I would like to ask is that you say your name. So when you identify yourself and say, I'm from whatever, yeah? So she will know something about the persons who are asking questions. Now, you raised a point at the beginning. Do you want to go back to your point? So perhaps we can start. If you want to say your name and where you... Yeah. Where are you based? Then we can start. And the others, just raise your hand and I'm taking notes.
Well, maybe I can start. You can hear.
Yeah.
They're recording. Okay. So, just hold.
I think it's just...
Thank you very much. I'm Javier Asensio. I'm a full-time economist at Autónoma, and I'm very interested in these issues. I want to raise a different point. Okay, I'm a bit puzzled, or I would disagree with this conclusion that I understood. You mentioned that the original root causes are more cultural than economic. It's not that I don't think that culture is important, but the way I see it, that's what I wanted to share, is that could it be that the original causes of the cultural differences end up being based on economic processes, okay? And my very simple model of what's going on, which is limited, would be that, say, globalization has succeeded with this specialization of international trade theory, and the case of the UK is very clear. So finance is where you have a comparative advantage, and the City of London has benefited a lot, but coal, mining, or heavy industry, Sunderland, has been left behind. Yeah. But that's going on for 50 years or more. And therefore, I would say that these cultural grievances, this lack of trust, this willingness to take control, it's not so much to take control over the governments, to take control over their lives because there are no jobs. Yeah. So in terms of the narrative, I would recommend that, that's why we recommend productivity increases, because that's going to attract employers and that's going to generate jobs, and these place-based job policies need to address that. But so my point is that in order to have a full picture, I think that those economic shocks continue to be the most important ones in order to understand the whole process and to revert it if possible. That's what we don't know how to do. Of course, we cannot bring back coal mining, but which are the new jobs that can be placed in those places? That would, I think, trigger a very slow and maybe not successful, but change in some of these grievances. But thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, yeah. I mean, I sort of partly agree with you. I think we agree on a lot. So this is why I showed this. I really like this model because I fully agree that the economic causes are an important driver historically. I think what we try to show is that they're not necessarily an immediate current driver. So and it's not actually the poorest places that voted for Brexit, for example. I'll give you one other example. This is a sort of just a case study, but the city of Hull in sort of northeast of England, very famous for its shipbuilding and trade, and of course declined because of the changes in global trade structures. And then recently they have found a niche in, there's a big offshore wind sector. And this is the ideal place because it's on the North Sea, there's no other purpose for it, they have the big ports and sort of expertise in the kinds of things that can be adapted to. So there's a big Siemens research and development center there for offshore wind linked to the university. So it's a big success story of green energy linked to a place-based policy to create jobs and linked to green energy. Very successful, but recently the Reform Party took control of that area. And now they're saying, because they're against any green technologies, that they want to close it down. So it is a bit weird. So these people voted for reform, who is against green energy, but that's what's providing them the jobs.
And they voted for Brexit?
And Brexit, yeah. So it's a bit like, that's why I think, I fully agree with you because as I said, I'm an economist by training, an economic geographer. I like economic stories, but I think there's something else. Yeah, but I agree with you on the other things, yeah.
Okay, now, thank you. We have 3 people who have asked
Yeah.
to raise their questions. So, you first, anyone second, anyone third. Anyone just raise your hand.
Yeah.
Please.
Thanks for the informative talk. I'm Hari. I'm doing postdoc. I'm a postdoc here in a group called photochemistry, so very far away from what we are seeing today. I have a couple of questions. Well, it's more of a prompts for discussion than questions. I cannot seem to decide whether the geographic inequality is good or bad. All inequalities are bad because on one hand it's people are forgotten, but on the other hand the popular place is bringing in the investments, the fundings and so on. So I do not know how to go from there.
Yeah.
And the second one is, if the older generations seem to vote for the populist parties and the younger generation go for the progressive ones, is there a correlation between the average age of the country and the party it chooses? Because it doesn't change in 4 years drastically, but the party changes every 4 years.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that's it.
Okay, 2 very good points. So on the second one, it is true that age is correlated with education. So it's partly an education effect because the younger generation more likely to go to university. And that is very strongly correlated with more sort of liberal, open politics. But even after we control for education, there's still a cohort, an age effect. It's not age really, it's cohort, so it's generational. But as we know, the young, something weird is happening among the young, which we need to explain. And maybe, yeah, I'd like to hear what's going on because I'm old and I'm not in this, I don't know what's going on in social media. So that's the one point. And then are regional inequalities good or bad? There's a big debate about this. So maybe we should just focus on the successful places, make them really successful, allow people to move there, and not worry about these other places. Eventually, everyone will leave and they'll just disappear. I suppose there is something in that, and there are lots of ghost towns in the US because historically they're just not viable anymore. The problem in the present is that people still live there. And so you have, at least in the UK, some coastal towns that are very old, sort of aging population, many different complex health problems to do with obesity and smoking and drug addiction and mental health. And we can't just leave them to it, right? They're still people, we have to do something with them. So there are, I think, particularly in economics, there's a point of a school of thought that says, let the market work. But in terms of if you're a policymaker, you can't do that. And these people still vote. So even though they're ill and they don't have jobs, they still vote. So you can't just ignore them, I suppose. So I think my argument would be because it's linked to social problems, we can't just ignore it.
So first of all, thank you very much.
Yeah.
It was a wonderful presentation. My name is Jürgen Volkert. I'm professor of economics at Potsdam University in Germany.
Okay.
And I find it most striking because I'm working on polarized resistance against climate protection. And many of the issues you mentioned, not surprisingly, can also be attributed to this kind of polarization, which is in another field. So thank you very much for that.
Yeah.
I have only one far-reaching question. Of course, I also struggle with the fact that the young generation is now also voting right-wing in Germany. We have the same thing in Germany. One question I ask myself, I did not check it, is the young generation today similar to the young generation yesterday? When we look at educational results, there are differences, and we know that less education reduces trust, generalized trust, and that reduces institutional trust. That's just a question, whether that might be of interest.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting and puzzling, and I guess really highlighted by the last 2 years of elections. So I suppose we're still trying to work it out. I have not looked it up either, but I don't think it's the education that's changing very much. I mean, there are issues with jobs. I think it's very hard to find jobs for young people. Issues with housing, which can be linked, I suppose, by these populist parties to immigration. So it maybe is that, I don't know. In the UK, we don't see it, so the young are still very progressive. But I wonder if this will change, because there's huge disillusionment with Labour now. And the other parties left are all more fringe. So I don't know what's going to happen. Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for a fantastic presentation. My name's Dan Brockington. I'm an anthropologist at the Autonomous. And I wondered if we look at the long-term histories of disengagement from politics. Colin Crouch 20 years ago was writing about post-democracy, and that the fact that voter turnouts were low in so many Western democracies, but that was attributed not to lack of trust, as I understand, but more a lack of engagement, a lack of desire to take part, of lack of perceived benefits. Mm-hmm. Is it possible to get good historical data to understand when this sort of disengagement that was more bored with the process became an active lack of trust, if that history is in fact correct?
Yeah, okay, yeah, really interesting. I know there's a literature in, so I don't know the anthropology literature very well, but I know that in sociology there's a literature looking at boredom. So if everything feels very stable, people become bored, and so they don't engage. And so some people have argued this is what started the low turnout. Yeah, that's all I can say. I've not really studied it, but I wonder if we do have historical data. It's a bit patchy because part of the problem is the boundaries change. So I had a student trying to look at these issues historically using European data. But then, of course, we have the change in Eastern Europe and the change in Germany, and so it's really hard to keep boundaries the same. So I guess that would be a challenge. But yeah, I agree with you. This is really interesting. So at what point did it turn, and was it before the globalization effect? Yeah.
Okay, very good. Questions, please? Oh, yeah, 2 questions here.
Should I just answer that?
No, the mic is here. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Paul Bouhabib. I teach at the University of Essex in England. So I wasn't sure I understood why you ended up with the conclusion that you ended up with, which was that we have to maybe encourage more local politics, more local participation. Because what you had said before seemed to me to suggest that what people in these areas are concerned about is their lack of control over larger forces that have to do with changes in technology, with how universities affect young people. You said they hate universities, for example. So giving them power over how to control the local transport network doesn't seem to solve the problem. So I was just kind of curious whether you could say more about that.
Yeah, okay, interesting. Yeah, so maybe I didn't, I was rushing a bit at the end. But one of the other things they are really upset about is, at least in the UK, as you know, is very centralized governance. So all the decisions are taken in London, and then they're just kind of trickle down and they have to take them. And the EU was a part of the same. So someone, a faceless person in Brussels decided, and now I'm getting this stadium. And so I think, this is the paper with Flavio, so we argued that even though a lot of the forces are global or national, if you give them more control over the local area, this is what people actually care about the most, what they see. So local jobs, local facilities, people complain about the high street having no shops. These are the things that, well, as they say, all politics is local. So you change the local thing and it really affects how people feel. That's our argument anyway. But I take your point, the big forces, robotics, AI, offshoring, immigration even globally, these are things, yeah, we can't really devolve. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Belén Derki. I work here at IQS in the Department of Marketing as a teacher. And I enjoyed the presentation very much, very interesting facts. As I am an economist, my background, but I've always worked in marketing, I have questions. What can be the role of social media in this polarization? Because maybe it can explain, because we tend to follow people we like, who think alike, and we tend to trust on these like fake news or the news. So it can have an influence in this, particularly for young people who follow and believe what they see in social media. Isn't that, could that explain also?
Yes, I mean, I completely agree with you. Social media is very polarizing. And we've seen it, and there's a lot of research, as you know, on the impact of social media and how it's used. And we've seen it with Twitter, how the algorithm has changed and is feeding certain stories to people. And in fact, all the surveys show when you ask people about the news, how they get news, very large numbers say they get them from social media. 80%. And I just saw an article this morning saying young people never read the news, they've never even opened a newspaper. So all the news they get are from social media. Yeah, so I think, yeah, really important area of research.
And I think that happens across every country.
Yeah, yeah.
How can policymakers change that?
Yeah, I mean, in the UK, there's a lot of debate about restricting use of social media for people under 16 so they don't get addicted. Restrictions, there's some debate now about restrictions on Twitter because of, yeah, but this is all now caught up with a trade deal with Trump, who has apparently demanded that they can't touch the company. So it's really difficult. I mean, I think it's possible, and I know the EU is trying to do more about disinformation on social media, but not my area of expertise, but I fully agree with you, and I can see it. And when I saw these adverts, I was so shocked because I had never seen any of them. You know, I was still on Facebook at the time. I had never been sent any of these. So clearly I'm not in the target demographic, but some people are seeing it, but the rest of us don't know that they're seeing them. So yeah, it's very scary. Yeah, so I guess in marketing there's a lot of potential for studying this, yeah. And now of course with AI now, who knows? Yeah, thank you.
Very good. Please.
Thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoy it. My name is Elba Ramos, and I'm Professor here at La Salle. I teach social entrepreneurship, and a lot of my students, I have always this big question. At the beginning of the semester, I used to ask them, what worry most for you in this stage? They have around 19 years old. Yeah. And it's very curious because you have mentioned something similar, because they really care about immigration. They are really worried about it. They are really worried about how to get good jobs. Yeah. And I saw some pattern that some of them, even if they have their own family or business, I mean, they don't have to worry about, but they still worry. Right. Because the social media, because all the environment is just the same topics once and over again. Yeah. And that's one of my comments. Mm-hmm. And you have mentioned too that parties like Donald Trump, they take advantage of needs in the market. I don't know what do you think about this specific issue, because I can see it from my country. I'm from Mexico, and there's an increasingly the nationalisms. They feel most Mexican people like to connect with the identity is one of the biggest strategies. Connect with being a real America, being a real Spanish from here. I don't know, from Catalonia, to have the lack of identity. They have identified this need, and they have taken, and I think that is one of the reasons they have. I don't know what is your opinion about it, and if you have studied those variables that they might have some influence.
Yeah, okay, yeah, really interesting. So on the issue of young people, it's actually quite interesting. There are studies that show, so they ask people, do you think immigration is for example, a big problem for the country as a whole? And 80, whatever, so 60, 70% say yes, it's a big problem. And then they ask them, do you think immigration is a problem for your local area? And they say, no, it's not. But then, of course, they all say that, so that can't be true on average. So so people see these stories in the national press or whatever, where they get their news. But of course, it's not happening locally, but they're still worried about it in some general way. So I think maybe this links to what you were saying. Although the issues of housing and jobs are very big concern for young people. Yeah, the immigration thing is slightly more worrying, I think. Sorry, I forgot what the party's finding a niche. Yes, I guess it's always easy, particularly in difficult economic times, to retreat and to be inward looking, and I think this is what's happening. And we have it in the UK, and I'm sure in other countries as well. Yeah.
Very good. We are getting to the final part here of the questions. So there's one question over there. Anyone else? So we have time to think.
Oh, let her ask.
Ralu, please. Oh, yeah.
So, hello.
Blue, at the end.
Yes.
Oh, yeah,
Blue.
good.
So, hello, my name is Ralu Taratori. I'm here a PhD candidate at the School of Management. I know you personally. But my question is, I see more and more studies and more and more attention and coverage media in the polarization between left and right, but less and less discussion about the vertical types of inequalities and what is happening there. And studies that are, I think, less explore how people can unite more in another basis than what utilizes the debate in the left and the right. Have you seen that somewhere? Like,
do you mean how to reach consensus rather
yes,
than...
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I discussed it briefly with Flavio because there have been attempts to build social media apps that try to bring people together rather than polarizing. So if you like something, things get upvoted if they're liked by people who the algorithm thinks are different, in order to try to generate more constructive debate. But of course, they're not as popular as the ones that generate disagreement because they get the clicks. So yeah, and in our paper, that's also why we discuss different forms of deliberation where, for example, if a local example to me, the council tried to, in Cambridge, create a congestion charge zone around the city and improve cycling paths. And this led to huge outcry, and there were demonstrations for and against. If you could get people in the same room, so the person who's worried about their child being hit by a car or pollution because they have asthma, sitting with the person who needs the car because they have a disability, talking together in order to understand the other position would lead to better policy. Sorry, I don't know if this answers your question, but I think there are ways of doing it, solving the polarization.
Just to allow people for the last question, perhaps, I'm going to get closer to you, so to your microphone. And then I'm going to put a question which is related to what Ralu was suggesting, because if you were to ask an economist about what is left and what is right wing in terms of the political preferences, people say, well, right wing are those people who believe in markets. Left wing are those people who believe in governments. because we believe in markets, we go for institutions, property rights, and then trickle-down effects. Let's promote economic growth, and then everything will follow. But then on the left side, we will talk about different things, how governments can actually get to those who are left behind, and then we would care about social services. And that seemed to be the standard definition.
Yeah.
Have things changed? How did they change? Are we talking about a left and right that's actually a moving left and right, and we don't even know what's left or right anymore?
Yes,
That's my
okay,
question.
sorry if I misunderstood. Okay, so there is a big debate about whether we've now shifted to an authoritarian open type, so authoritarian liberal or closed versus open type divide rather than left and right. And where the old parties have reshaped themselves to fit into that new, so those new dimensions. So I mean, it's not my area, but I can see that. I can see that and the old, for example, in the UK, the old Labour Party have never been very liberal, but they have been on the left, and are now trying to find a niche which is turning them into something much more right-wing, but keeping the slightly more authoritarian angle. At least that's how I see it. Leaving a big gap on the left for a liberal left party, which the Liberal Democrats, who were the old Liberal Party, more sort of conservative, are now filling. So yes, I agree that this is changing, but it's not my area, but that's my feeling.
Now we have time for the last question. You don't have to leave, it's fine. But, no, not me, the last question. So, anyone here? David's moving. Yeah.
Yes, I'm Josep García Blandón. I'm professor of finance here at IQS. Now, just connected with your wonderful presentation, I recently heard in the media about surveys conducted in several countries in the European Union. Well, also in England, I think, in the UK. For young people understood between, I don't know, 18, 35, something, and a very, very large percentage of them preferred to live in a dictatorship. So they didn't value democracy. Yeah. So, I mean, well, we are talking about, at the end, I think it's a question of values, all these, because I don't know if say, too shocked, but a bit shocked by by this, because, well, if a large majority of this supposed to be very well educated or better educated generation than previous one, well, don't mind to live in a dictatorship, I don't think there is much to do. This is not a question, I'm sorry. I wanted to share this with you.
No, just briefly, I mean, I saw this as well, and it was quite shocking. And I also tried to work out what was happening. So is it maybe that the parents have struggled and that's what the young people see? Or is it they feel the system is just not working and it would be better to have a more planned system? Yeah, I guess maybe we need to do more to explain. I mean, that's partly what we wrote the paper about. So how to involve people, not just young people, but in the process and make it more, the process seemed to be more fair and transparent to increase support for the institutions. So I think it's part of what, I think we know what the problem is. The question is how to solve it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And now the last question.
No, the last from, I'm David Castillo. I'm also professor of finance at IQS School of Management. Just building on this data that Josep has written up, there is also an important gender difference here. So there is like, and I read some reports and also a book from a professor at the Brookings Institute that talked about the gender crisis, the male crisis, especially in between the youngest population, and he claimed that there is something that has been lost for this new generation, so they are like losing their references and the model and so on. So this may explain also these differences, because the results were mostly driven by male responders. So I think female responders were more on the left side of the data, and male young people were those that are credited to this situation. Yeah. So I don't know if the gender has a place here, and maybe may explain it's a cultural issue, but maybe a consequence also of some economic factors and so on. But yeah, I think a gender approach and gender view may be interesting also here. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, just briefly, so the gender issue is really interesting and quite worrying. In the UK, we have the UK labour market statistics are really messed up. So the data, we have some issues with the data, but recently this is the first year when low-skilled women are earning more than low-skilled men. So we see that the lines sort of crossed over. It's not true for the high-skilled, the men still earn more than women, but for low-skilled jobs, the women have overtaken men. And I think it's partly to do with the kinds of jobs that low-skilled that you could do without a degree as a man, traditionally male jobs have disappeared. So in factories and so on. But the jobs that traditionally young women who were unskilled have done in shops and in service jobs are still there. So I don't know if this is related, but I think there's an economic story behind the gender divides as well, plus the social media issues and so on. But I fully agree, gender is a really interesting angle to this.
No, thank you so much. We are on time, so just to conclude, it's amazing. Yeah,
yes.
we can look here. So, but then, just to conclude, 3 big thanks and 1 apology. Yeah, the first big thanks for all of you who have joined us here. It was an excellent discussion. So thank you so much for being here, for participating of these conversations. That's extremely important for us. The second big thanks is the institutional one. We concluded a wonderful series, yes, and that support came from the general director and all our governing body for that. So thank you so much for that. Now the apology. The apology is that people said some people would be on the floor. I said, no. Of course, I'm terribly sorry. We should have put, then we had some spare here when people stood, but then my apologies for that. And then the final one, which I'm totally confident you want to join me in that, is to thank you for this very inspiring, and knowledgeable talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.